The courtroom was a place where silence often carried more weight than words. Inside the old county courthouse, with its polished wooden benches and high-arched windows, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The faint smell of varnish mixed with paper lingered in the air, and the hum of the ceiling fans offered the only steady sound. Everyone knew this was not an ordinary case. Reporters sat near the back, their pens ready, while townsfolk filled the gallery, eager yet uneasy about what they were about to witness. At the center of it all sat Emily Parker, a 10-year-old girl with wide, anxious eyes. She was small for her age, her feet dangling above the courtroom floor as she clutched her mother's hand tightly. Emily's blonde hair was neatly brushed into a ponytail, but strands had escaped and clung nervously to her damp cheeks. Her pale fingers twisted the hem of her dress, betraying the storm of fear raging inside her. She wasn't just a child in court, she was the case's key witness. Beside her sat Max, a golden retriever with soft amber eyes and a calmness that contrasted the tension in the room. Max wasn't an ordinary pet. He was a trained service dog, assigned to help children who had experienced trauma find the strength to testify in court. His vest, marked with the words "Support Animal, Do Not Distract," spoke volumes about his purpose. But to Emily, he wasn't a symbol or a tool. He was her best friend, her protector, her lifeline. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a reputation for strictness, took his seat at the bench. Judge Harrison was not known for leniency or theatrics. He was a man who demanded truth and order in his courtroom. Yet even he glanced at Emily with a softened gaze, aware of the burden resting on her fragile shoulders. He tapped the gavel once, a sound that echoed like thunder across the room. "All rise," the bailiff commanded, and everyone stood. When the judge nodded, the crowd sat back down. The scrape of chairs against the wooden floor seemed louder than usual, heightening Emily's nerves. Her mother, Sarah, whispered softly in her ear, "You're safe, sweetheart. Just tell the truth. That's all you need to do." But Emily didn't answer. She stared at the defense table where the man accused of wrongdoing sat. His presence alone made her stomach churn. His cold eyes flickered in her direction, and Emily's heart raced so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She lowered her gaze instantly, clinging tighter to Max's leash. The prosecutor, a woman named Linda Reynolds, had prepared Emily carefully for this moment. For weeks, they had rehearsed questions, walked through the courtroom, and practiced speaking. But nothing could fully prepare a child for the real thing: the stares, the weight of strangers' judgment, the imposing presence of the man she was testifying against. Max shifted slightly, leaning against Emily's leg. His warmth spread into her, a subtle reminder that she wasn't alone. Emily reached down, her small fingers brushing his soft fur, and exhaled shakily. "Emily Parker," the bailiff called out, "please step forward to the witness stand." The room grew still as Emily let go of her mother's hand. Her steps were small and hesitant, each one echoing loudly in her ears. She climbed into the tall wooden chair meant for witnesses, her feet barely brushing the stool provided beneath. Max settled himself at her side, curling neatly at her feet, but keeping his gaze watchful. The clerk approached with the oath. "Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "I do." Her words trembled, and the microphone amplified the shake for everyone to hear. The defense attorney, a sharp-faced man in a gray suit, shuffled his papers deliberately. He had been skeptical about allowing a dog into the courtroom, but the judge had overruled his objections, citing Emily's right to testify in a supportive environment. Still, he intended to test her resolve. Prosecutor Reynolds gave Emily a reassuring nod before beginning. "Emily, can you please tell the court your name?" Emily hesitated, her throat tight, but managed. "Emily Parker." Her voice was soft, but the name was clear enough to echo in the quiet courtroom. Max looked up at her, tail wagging once before he settled back down. "Good," Reynolds continued gently. "And how old are you?" 10, Emily said. There was another pause. Her hands twisted together, and her shoulders hunched as though she wished to disappear. Reynolds slowed her pace, trying not to overwhelm her, but Emily's eyes kept darting nervously toward the defense table. The defense attorney cleared his throat, and though he said nothing yet, his mere presence seemed to suffocate her. Emily's breath quickened. She tugged on Max's leash, needing to feel his presence more firmly. Max nudged her hand with his nose, and she stroked his fur under the desk. But the real questions were yet to come. The jury leaned forward slightly, sensing the child's unease. People in the gallery sat still, almost holding their breath. The trial had been building to this moment for weeks. Everyone wanted to hear what Emily had to say, but no one wanted to pressure her more than she already was. Judge Harrison, breaking the heavy silence, leaned forward slightly. "Take your time, young lady," he said in a voice gentler than most had ever heard him use. "You are safe here." Emily nodded faintly, but her lips refused to form words. The pressure was unbearable, the fear unshakable. Her testimony was the key to truth, yet at that moment, silence held her captive. Max shifted again, pressing closer against her. His steady breathing was the only rhythm she could trust. Emily squeezed his leash so tightly her knuckles turned white. And though she had yet to speak, something about the way the little girl and her dog leaned into one another sent a ripple through the room. The judge, the jury, even the stern defense attorney, they all noticed it. It was just the beginning, but everyone could feel it. Something extraordinary was about to happen. The air in the courtroom was heavy, as though the walls themselves leaned in, waiting for Emily to speak. She sat perched on the tall witness chair, her back stiff, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The microphone in front of her seemed like a weapon rather than a tool, magnifying the silence with cruel precision. The prosecutor, Linda Reynolds, tried again, her tone warm and measured. "Emily, can you tell us where you were on the evening of March 17th? Emily's lips parted. Her eyes darted toward the defense table where the accused sat, his cold stare fixed firmly on her. The words dissolved on her tongue. All she could manage was a faint squeak, a sound so fragile it broke off before it became a word. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge raised his hand for silence, his expression unreadable, but his eyes gentle. He knew this was the moment that could unravel everything. Without Emily's testimony, the prosecution's case was hanging by a thread. Emily stared down at her hands, trembling so hard she clenched them together to make them stop. She wanted to answer. She wanted to shout the truth, so the man who had hurt so many could never do it again. But fear wrapped around her throat like invisible chains. Max shifted at her feet, sensing her unease. His tail brushed against her shoes, and his warm presence reminded her she wasn't completely alone. Still, her body refused to cooperate. "Emily," Reynolds said softly, "remember what we talked about. Just tell the truth, as if you're speaking to me in my office." Emily's chest rose and fell rapidly. She opened her mouth, but once again, silence claimed her. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, with a smug smile tugging at the corner of his lips. To him, this was a victory. If the child couldn't testify, the jury would have little to convict his client on. He folded his arms, watching Emily struggle as though it were a game he was winning. The prosecutor pressed gently. "Do you need a moment, Emily?" The little girl shook her head, but her eyes brimmed with tears. The courtroom blurred in her vision. All she could see clearly was Max's golden fur below her, his calm figure anchoring her in the storm. The defense attorney rose, straightening his tie. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "it seems the witness is unable to proceed." I request that we consider excusing her testimony on the grounds that she is clearly too frightened to contribute anything meaningful to this case. The words hit Emily like a stone. Too frightened. Too weak. Too useless. She pressed her palms against her knees, trying to ground herself. The thought of being dismissed without ever saying what she needed to say terrified her even more than speaking did. Judge Harrison's brow furrowed. Counselor, this child has every right to be heard. She will not be dismissed without cause. His voice was firm, but inside he wondered if Reynolds had pushed Emily too soon. He turned back to the witness stand, his tone softening. Emily, you don't need to be afraid here. No one in this room can hurt you. You are safe. Safe. The word echoed in her mind, but safety felt like a lie when those same cold eyes from the defense table pinned her in place. The prosecutor tried again, slower this time. Emily, you know Max is here to help you. Can you tell us where were you when it happened? Her throat burned. She tried to force the words out, but the fear was overwhelming. In her mind, she was back in that dark moment, reliving every sound, every detail, every terror that had brought her here. Speaking it aloud felt like tearing open a wound in front of strangers. She began, her voice a fragile whisper. Then nothing. Tears welled up and spilled down her cheeks. Gasps came from the jury box. One juror, a mother herself, pressed her lips together tightly as if holding back tears of her own. Another juror shifted uncomfortably, clearly moved by the sight of the trembling child. Emily's mother sat in the front row, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart broke watching her daughter freeze. She wanted to rush forward, to gather her child into her arms, but she knew she couldn't interfere. Max nudged Emily's leg again, this time with a firmer push. He looked up at her with calm, steady eyes. His presence was a quiet reminder of the secret tool she carried, the small hand signal they had practiced countless times during therapy sessions. A gesture meant to give her courage when fear stole her voice. But Emily didn't use it yet. She wiped her tears, staring down at the dog, wishing she could disappear into his fur forever. The defense attorney rose once more, eager to twist the silence into his advantage. Your Honor, he said with mock sympathy, this poor child is clearly traumatized. Forcing her to testify only reopens her wounds. I respectfully insist this testimony be deemed unreliable. Reynolds snapped back quickly. This testimony is critical. With support, Emily can speak. She turned to the little girl again, her tone more urgent, but still kind. Emily, we're here for you. All of us, you're not alone. Max is right here with you. Just one word, start with one word. The room leaned in, every ear straining for her response. Emily's small chest heaved as she drew in a shaky breath. Her lips quivered, and for a heartbeat, it looked like she might finally speak. But then the fear surged again, paralyzing her. No words came. The silence was deafening. The judge sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, waiting for his next move. He didn't want to end her testimony, but he couldn't let the silence drag on forever. Max pressed closer once more, his fur brushing against Emily's trembling hand. She gripped it instinctively, holding on as if to an anchor. Deep down, she remembered the lessons from therapy. The secret code. The silent promise Max had made to her. Whenever she felt too weak to speak, she only had to give the signal, and he would remind her of her strength. But fear still held her back. Her eyes flicked to the judge, then to the jury, then back to Max. A spark of determination flickered, brief but real. She wiped her cheeks with her sleeve, trying to gather the courage she had left. The courtroom waited. The silence stretched on, unbearable but unbroken. And then, very slowly, Emily's fingers twitched. Not yet the full signal, but the first tentative motion toward it. The moment was small, almost invisible, but it carried the weight of a promise. The silence would not last forever. The courtroom seemed to shrink around Emily. The polished wood, the high ceilings, the rows of strangers, all of it pressed inward until she felt like a trapped bird with no escape. Every heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out the muffled coughs and shuffles from the gallery. Her trembling hand brushed against Max's fur again. The golden retriever sat calmly at her feet, his amber eyes steady, his body warm against her legs. To everyone else, he was just a dog doing his job. To Emily, he was the only safe place in a world that had turned frightening and overwhelming. She remembered the first time she had met Max, months earlier. She had been sitting in a small therapy room, knees tucked into her chest, unable to speak about what she had seen. The therapist had gently introduced Max, who padded over, laid his head on her lap, and sighed as if to say, "I'm here now." Emily had cried into his fur that day, and it was the first time she had felt understood without saying a word. From then on, Max had been more than a dog. He was her voice when fear silenced her. Now, in the crowded courtroom, that bond was being tested. The prosecutor's voice cut through her thoughts, soft but firm. "Emily, you don't need to rush. Just take your time." "We're listening." Emily tried again. Her lips parted, her breath shuddered, but still, no words came. Her eyes blurred with tears as frustration boiled in her chest. She wanted so badly to speak, to release the truth she had carried in silence for so long. But fear clamped down again, stealing her courage. Max shifted, pressing his warm body closer against her leg. She glanced down. His tail thumped softly against the wooden floor once, twice steady, rhythmic, grounding her in the moment. She inhaled shakily. Then, almost without thinking, her fingers began to move. It was a tiny gesture, one they had practiced together with her therapist. She curled her fingers slightly, brushing the back of her hand twice against Max's shoulder, their secret signal. It was a request, silent and sacred. "I'm scared. Remind me you're here." Max responded instantly. He lifted one paw and placed it gently on her lap, his claws retracted, his touch deliberate and calm. His paw was warm, solid, and heavy enough to anchor her to the present. The room seemed to still. The jury noticed the exchange. Their curiosity piqued, though they couldn't understand the meaning behind it. To them, it was simply a dog comforting a child. But to Emily, it was everything. Her chest loosened just enough to let out a shaky whisper. "I." Every head turned. The gallery leaned forward. The judge's eyes widened slightly as he leaned toward the microphone. "Please, Emily, speak when you're ready." Emily looked at Max. His paw remained steady on her lap. She repeated the gesture with her fingers, and again he pressed down, answering her silent plea. This time, her voice came out stronger. "I was at home." The words were faint, but they were words. The prosecutor nodded encouragingly, her face breaking into a gentle smile. "That's very good, Emily. Thank you. Can you tell us a little more about that night?" Emily hesitated, her throat tightening again. The fear clawed at her, but Max's paw reminded her she wasn't alone. She stroked his fur with trembling fingers, focusing on the texture, the warmth, the familiarity. It was enough to steady her. She looked up at the jury, then quickly back down. "I was at home. In my room." The jury members exchanged glances. The child who had been silent just moments before was beginning to speak. It was slow, halting, but undeniable progress. The defense attorney frowned, his smugness fading. He scribbled notes furiously, clearly annoyed that the girl had found her footing. His client shifted uncomfortably in his chair, no longer confident in the outcome. Emily's mother clutched her hands together in silent prayer. She could see the courage building in her daughter's small frame, each word a victory against the silence that had threatened to consume her. The prosecutor pressed on gently. "Emily, do you remember what happened after you were in your room?" Emily froze, her voice catching in her throat. The memory was too close, too painful. Her eyes welled with tears, and she began to shake. The fear returned like a wave threatening to knock her under. But then she made the gesture again twice against Max's shoulder. And Max, patient as ever, pressed his paw firmly against her lap once more. His eyes never wavered from hers. It was their code, their promise. Emily closed her eyes and whispered, "I heard shouting." The words hung in the air like a fragile glass ornament, delicate but powerful. The prosecutor nodded slowly. "And then what happened, sweetheart?" Emily opened her eyes. Her lip quivered, but she pushed forward. I looked out the door. I saw," her voice faltered. She turned her head, unwilling to meet the defendant's stare. Max leaned further into her leg, grounding her again. She took another breath, gave him the gesture, and felt his paw steady her once more. Her voice, trembling but audible, finally finished the thought. "I saw him." A gasp echoed through the courtroom. The defendant shifted violently in his seat, his attorney putting a hand on his arm to calm him. The jury's eyes sharpened with interest. For the first time, the case had a living, breathing eyewitness putting words to the crime. Emily sagged slightly in her chair, exhausted by the effort, but Max didn't move. His paw remained steady, his eyes calm, his body a shield against her fear. The judge, visibly moved, leaned back in his chair. His face was composed, but inside he felt the significance of what he had just witnessed. It wasn't just testimony. It was courage drawn from the unlikeliest of sources, a small girl and her silent companion. The prosecutor gave Emily a moment to breathe, not pushing her too hard. She knew this breakthrough was only the beginning. Emily had more to share, but forcing it all at once could undo the fragile progress. In the gallery, a hush remained, broken only by the sound of Max's soft breathing and Emily's uneven sniffles. Everyone had seen it. Everyone understood, even without explanation, that something profound had just unfolded. The silence that had once threatened to destroy the case had been broken not by force, not by pressure, but by the silent bond between a girl and her dog. And though the trial was far from over, one truth had become clear. Emily was not as fragile as she seemed. With Max by her side, she had found a way to speak. The moment Emily whispered, "I saw him," seemed to freeze the air in the courtroom. For weeks, people had wondered whether this little girl would be able to speak at all. Now, with Max's paw resting firmly on her lap, she had spoken the words that tied her to the truth. Her chest heaved as if every breath were a battle. Tears clung to her lashes, but her eyes carried a flicker of determination, faint yet real. She glanced down at Max, her fingers brushing his fur again. Then, with trembling certainty, she repeated the secret gesture, 2 soft taps against his shoulder. Max responded as faithfully as always, placing his paw firmly on her thigh. The action was so simple, so quiet, that most people in the room didn't understand its meaning. But Emily did. It wasn't just a paw. It was a promise. A silent reminder. You are not alone. You are stronger than you think. The prosecutor's voice was steady, careful not to push too hard. "Emily," she said gently, "you're doing very well. Can you tell us what you saw when you opened the door?" Emily bit her lip, glancing nervously toward the defense table. The man sitting there leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. His stare had haunted her dreams, and seeing him again now made her want to shrink into the wooden chair. For a second, her voice caught, and she almost slipped back into silence. But Max shifted, leaning heavier against her leg. She gave the gesture again. Paw, steady, safe. Her voice, though shaky, found its way out. I saw him. In the hallway. He was yelling. The jury leaned forward, pens scratching quickly across notepads. Several jurors exchanged glances, the weight of her words clear in their expressions. The defense attorney shot up, his tone sharp. Objection, Your Honor. The child is clearly distressed and may not be providing reliable testimony. Judge Harrison raised a hand. Overruled. The witness is allowed to continue. Counsel, you will refrain from interrupting unless you have grounds. The defense attorney bit his lip, visibly irritated, but sat back down. Emily's hands twisted together again, but the gesture was becoming her lifeline. She tapped Max once more, and he lifted his paw, anchoring her. She could feel his heartbeat steady against her arm as she leaned slightly into him. The prosecutor nodded encouragingly. Emily, did you hear what he was saying? Her breath came ragged, but she whispered, he was saying, don't tell anyone. The gallery gasped softly. Reporters scribbled furiously. The defendant's jaw clenched tight, his face paling slightly. Emily glanced nervously at him again, but this time, instead of shrinking away, she gave Max the signal. Paw. Warmth. Courage. Her voice grew firmer. He was looking at me when he said it. The prosecutor paused, giving the weight of her words time to sink in. Then she asked, and do you see the person you're talking about in this courtroom today? Emily hesitated. This was the hardest question of all. Pointing him out meant sealing the truth, making it undeniable. Her fingers trembled against the wood of the witness stand. For a moment, fear almost swallowed her again. But then she looked down at Max, his paw still pressed against her leg, his eyes unwavering. She gave the gesture, slow and deliberate. Paw, pressure, promise. Her voice, though quivering, rang clear enough to echo across the room. Yes. The prosecutor leaned closer. Can you point to him, Emily? Emily's small hand rose, shaking violently. Slowly, she lifted her finger and pointed directly at the man sitting at the defense table. A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the sound of pens stopped as the jury froze in the weight of the moment. The defendant shifted uncomfortably, his attorney whispering harshly in his ear. Emily's mother buried her face in her hands, tears spilling down her cheeks. She had prayed her daughter would find this strength, but seeing it unfold was almost too much for her heart to bear. The judge's eyes softened. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but reverent. Let the record show that the witness has identified the defendant. Emily sagged slightly, her energy drained, but Max nudged her arm as if to say, you did it. Keep going. She stroked his fur, clinging to him like a life raft. The prosecutor, careful not to overwhelm her, kept her voice gentle. You're very brave, Emily. Just a few more questions, all right? Emily nodded weakly, wiping her tears on her sleeve. After he spoke to you, Reynolds continued, what did you do? Emily took a deep breath, her fingers already signaling Max again. Paw, pressure, safety. She clutched the edge of the stand and whispered, I ran back into my room. I hid under my bed. A juror visibly flinched, her hand flying to her mouth at the image of a small child cowering under a bed while danger lurked outside. And what happened next? The prosecutor asked. Emily swallowed hard. I heard the door slam. Then it got quiet. But I was too scared to come out. I stayed there until my mom found me. Her mother, seated just feet away, broke into silent sobs, her shoulders shaking. She wanted nothing more than to run up and hold her daughter, but she forced herself to remain still. Emily had to finish this herself. The prosecutor gave a small nod, stepping back slightly. Thank you, Emily. That was very brave. The defense attorney immediately stood. Your Honor, I request a recess. This child's testimony is being exaggerated by emotion, and the presence of the dog is clearly influencing her statements. Objection to the objection, Reynolds snapped before the judge could respond. The dog's presence is legally permitted and has done nothing but help this child communicate the truth she's been too frightened to say aloud. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and final. Enough. The testimony stands. Emily slumped in her chair, drained but somehow lighter. The silence she had carried like a burden was no longer inside her. She looked down at Max, gave him the signal one more time, and whispered, "Good boy." He wagged his tail once quietly, as though even he knew the solemnity of the moment. The jury's eyes never left Emily. In their expressions, something had changed. They weren't just listening to a frightened child. They were witnessing courage in its purest form. And though the trial was far from over, it was clear to everyone in the room. The secret bond between a little girl and her dog had just changed everything. For a moment after Emily pointed at the defendant, silence gripped the courtroom. It wasn't the usual kind of silence. This one carried weight, like everyone was afraid to move in case it broke the fragile courage hanging in the air. Judge Harrison tapped his pen lightly against the desk, then leaned forward. His eyes softened in a way that surprised many who knew his reputation for being stern. "Young lady," he said, his voice firm but gentle, "you've shown remarkable bravery today." Emily ducked her head, her face hot with both fear and pride. She didn't feel brave. Her hands were still trembling, her heart racing, but Max's steady paw reminded her she wasn't alone. She tapped his shoulder again, her secret signal, and felt the familiar pressure return. A small smile flickered across her lips. But the fragile calm didn't last long. The defense attorney, Mr. Carlton, rose with the sharpness of a man cornered. His voice rang across the courtroom. "Your Honor, while no one can deny the emotion in this child's testimony, we must also recognize the possibility of suggestion. She has clearly been influenced by the prosecution, by her mother, and most importantly, by the presence of this dog." He spat the word dog as though it were an insult. The gallery stirred, whispers rising. A reporter scribbled furiously, capturing the drama as it unfolded. Prosecutor Reynolds was on her feet in an instant. "Objection. This is a baseless attempt to discredit a child who has just demonstrated extraordinary courage." Carlton raised a hand in mock patience. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the defense must be allowed to question the reliability of a witness who admits she was hiding under a bed during key moments. This so-called testimony could easily be the result of coaching or imagination." Emily flinched at the word imagination. Her throat tightened, and for a second, her gaze darted downward. What if they didn't believe her? What if they thought she was making it all up? Sensing her hesitation, Max nudged her again, resting his head against her arm. The simple weight of his muzzle grounded her. She gave the signal 2 taps. He pressed his paw back. It was as though the world's noise dimmed, leaving only her and Max's silent language. Judge Harrison's gavel struck once. "Counsel, you may cross-examine the witness, but you will do so respectfully. This court will not tolerate intimidation." Carlton adjusted his tie, his lips tightening in irritation. Then he approached the stand slowly, his eyes locked on Emily. "Emily," he began smoothly, his tone suddenly sweet, almost coaxing. "You said you saw my client in the hallway, yes?" Emily swallowed. "Yes. And you say he was yelling? That he told you not to tell anyone?" "Yes," she whispered. He leaned closer, his shadow falling across her. "But you also said you ran and hid, didn't you? Under your bed?" Emily nodded, hugging Max's neck. "Which means," Carlton said, spreading his hands theatrically toward the jury, "she couldn't possibly have seen what actually happened. She was under a bed, out of sight, terrified, imagining things in the dark. The defense attorney's words hit Emily like stones. The murmurs in the courtroom rose again. For a moment, tears welled in her eyes. What if he was right? What if nobody believed her? Max stirred. He seemed to sense the storm inside her, shifting his weight closer, his paw firm against her leg. She tapped his fur again, and the world steadied. Her voice trembled, but she found it. "I wasn't imagining," she whispered. Carlton arched a brow. "Oh? And how can you be so sure, Emily? Children have very active imaginations, don't they? Maybe you were just scared, and your mind invented something." Emily looked down at Max, tapped twice, and waited. His paw pressed back, solid as ever. She took a shaky breath and lifted her eyes to meet Carlton's. "Because I heard his voice," she said louder this time. "It wasn't in my imagination. It was real. He was right there." The jury leaned forward again. Carlton frowned, but pressed on. "You're saying you know his voice? That you could recognize it without doubt?" Emily's lips quivered, but then she gave Max another signal. Paw, pressure, courage. "Yes," she said firmly. "I could never forget it." Carlton's face tightened. He had hoped to rattle her, to push her back into silence. Instead, her answers were growing steadier, stronger, as though the dog's presence was building a wall between her and fear. He tried a new tactic. "Emily, has anyone told you what to say today? Did your mother or the prosecutor suggest what you should remember?" Emily's eyes widened. "No, nobody told me. Max helps me. That's all." The courtroom fell silent again. For the first time, Emily had openly acknowledged her secret bond. Carlton chuckled bitterly. "Ah, so the dog tells you what to say now?" He turned to the jury, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, are we truly to base a man's freedom on the testimony of a child who relies on signals from an animal?" Gasps rippled through the room. Carlton thought he had scored a point. But Judge Harrison leaned forward, his gaze cold. "Mr. Carlton, enough mockery. This child is testifying in a manner approved by the court. You will proceed without belittling her bond with her therapy dog." Carlton gritted his teeth, but obeyed. Still, Emily's face burned with shame. Had she said too much? Would they laugh at her now? Max pressed closer, his paw unyielding. She tapped him again, and he responded. Suddenly, she didn't care about laughter. She wasn't here to please them. She was here to tell the truth. Carlton sighed dramatically. No further questions. The prosecutor rose, her eyes blazing with quiet pride. "Emily, I have just one more question." Emily turned toward her, Max steady by her side. "Why did you decide to speak today, after all this time?" Reynolds asked softly. Emily's chest rose and fell. She thought of the nights spent in silence, the dreams where fear stole her voice. She thought of her mother's tears, of the endless weight pressing on her small shoulders. Then she thought of Max, how he had never once left her side, how he always answered her secret signal without fail. Her voice, though still fragile, carried across the room. "Because Max told me I could." Gasps erupted again, but this time it wasn't disbelief, it was awe. The jury's expression softened. Even the judge blinked rapidly, as though the words had struck him deeper than expected. Emily hugged Max tightly, burying her face in his fur. The courtroom wasn't silent anymore. It was alive, buzzing with the realization that something extraordinary had just happened. The bond between a child and her dog had done what months of therapy, questioning, and preparation could not. It had broken through fear and given voice to the truth. And though the trial still had miles to go, everyone present knew that from this moment onward, the case would never be the same. The words, "because Max told me I could," seemed to hang in the air long after Emily spoke them. They weren't dramatic in volume, but in weight. Every person in the courtroom felt their power, as though a curtain had been pulled back, revealing courage in its purest form. The judge shifted in his chair, his usually stoic face betraying the slightest flicker of emotion. He cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain composure. "The witness has answered," he said, his voice steady but softer than before. "Let it be entered into record." Across the room, the jurors exchanged glances. Some nodded almost imperceptibly. Others scribbled furiously in their notebooks. What they had just witnessed was not the rehearsed speech of a coached child. It was raw, unfiltered honesty, spoken through the bond of trust between a little girl and her dog. Prosecutor Reynolds gave a respectful nod to Emily. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Harrison inclined his head. "Very well. The witness may step down." Emily hesitated, gripping the edge of the witness stand. Her legs felt like jelly, the weight of exhaustion threatening to pull her down. But Max nudged her, his steady presence giving her enough strength to slide off the chair. Together, they walked toward her mother, each step heavy but triumphant. Her mother rose, tears streaming freely now, and bent to embrace her. Emily buried her face in her mother's shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of home. Max circled once, then sat beside them, tail thumping softly against the floor. It was a picture no one in that courtroom would forget. The defense stumbles at the defense table. Carlton shuffled his papers, frustration etched across his face. His client leaned close, hissing something under his breath. Carlton raised a hand, signaling for patience, though his jaw clenched tightly. He knew the case had taken a dangerous turn. A child's testimony could be fragile, easy to poke holes in. But Emily's words, combined with her bond with the dog, had struck the jury in a way no lawyer's argument could undo. "Relax," he whispered to his client. "It's not over yet." Sympathy doesn't equal guilt, but even he knew the tide was shifting. The courtroom buzzed. As the judge called a brief recess, the room erupted in whispers. Reporters darted toward the doors, eager to relay the moment to waiting news vans outside. Some people reached for their phones, typing frantically. A gray-haired woman in the gallery dabbed her eyes with a tissue. "That little girl," she murmured to the man beside her. "She's braver than most adults I know." A young juror, no older than 25, stared at Emily and Max with an expression somewhere between admiration and awe. He didn't say it aloud, but in his mind, the case had already shifted. The media storm outside the courthouse. Cameras clicked and microphones stretched toward anyone willing to speak. Within minutes, headlines began flashing across news sites and social media feeds. Little girl's dog helps her testify in courtroom. Therapy dog gives child courage to point out alleged attacker. Judge stunned by young girl's words. Max told me I could. Clips of the testimony, recorded by court artists and described by journalists, spread like wildfire. Talk shows debated the unusual role of courtroom dogs. Advocates for child witnesses praised the breakthrough. Skeptics questioned whether animals should be allowed such influence in serious trials. But one fact was undeniable. Emily's courage had captured the nation's attention. Behind the doors, back inside the courthouse, Emily sat with her mother in a quiet room reserved for witnesses. Max lay at her feet, his head resting comfortably on her shoe. Emily absent-mindedly stroked his ears, the tension slowly leaving her body. Her mother brushed back a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Emily shook her head. "I was so scared, Mama. I almost couldn't do it." Her mother kissed her forehead. "But you did. And you were stronger than you knew." Emily looked down at Max, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "It was Max. He's the one who made me strong." Her mother's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. She reached down and patted Max's head. "Then we'll never forget what he's done for you." The judge's reflection in his chambers. Judge Harrison sat in silence for several minutes. He had presided over countless cases, theft, fraud, violent crime, and had seen hardened criminals brought to tears, seasoned lawyers crumble under pressure. But rarely had he witnessed something so quietly powerful as a child finding her voice through the presence of a dog. He removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Remarkable," he muttered under his breath. Absolutely remarkable, though he would never admit it openly. He knew Emily's words had touched him in a way that no legal argument could. The jury's quiet shift. Back in the jury room during the recess, the 12 men and women sat in hushed conversation. "That girl wasn't lying," one juror said firmly. "You could see it in her eyes." "Children don't fake something like that," another added. "Not with that kind of fear and relief when she finally said it." A third juror tapped his pen thoughtfully. "The dog is what convinced me. She wasn't performing for us. She was speaking to him, and we just happened to hear it." While no official decision was made, deliberations were far in the future. The seeds of belief had been firmly planted. The defendant's frustration, meanwhile, the defendant sat in the holding area with clenched fists. "This is ridiculous," he snapped at his attorney. "A kid and a dog? That's what's going to bring me down?" Carlton raised a warning hand. "Calm yourself. Outbursts won't help." But even as he spoke, his mind churned. He was skilled at dismantling evidence, poking holes in alibis, challenging witnesses. Yet how did one dismantle the unshakable trust between a child and her dog? A nation watches by evening. The story dominated headlines across the country. News anchors replayed Emily's words, commentators debated their implications, and social media flooded with messages of support. "Stay strong, Emily." One post read, "Max deserves a medal," another declared. A trending hashtag appeared. Hashtag because Max told me ICOULD. Emily had never asked for attention, never wanted to be in the spotlight. But without realizing it, she and Max had become symbols of courage, not just for child witnesses, but for anyone who had ever felt silenced by fear. The next step, when court reconvened, the atmosphere was electric. The defense appeared shaken, the prosecution emboldened, the jury attentive in a way they hadn't been before. Emily was no longer on the stand, but her presence lingered in every corner of the room. Her words, her gesture, her bond with Max, they had set the stage for what would come next. And though the trial was far from over, everyone sensed that something fundamental had shifted. The little girl who once sat in silence had spoken. The dog who once comforted her in secret had become her voice. And the truth, once buried, was beginning to rise to the surface. The next morning, the courthouse was already buzzing before the doors opened. Camera crews jostled for position, reporters rehearsed their lines, and curious onlookers filled the sidewalks just to catch a glimpse of the little girl and her dog who had captured the nation's attention. Inside, the atmosphere was even more charged. Jurors filed into their seats with the quiet solemnity of people who knew the world was watching. Prosecutor Reynolds sat poised, her files neatly stacked, her eyes sharp with purpose. On the other side, defense attorney Carlton shuffled his papers with less confidence than before. His client leaned toward him, face twisted with anger. "You better fix this," the defendant hissed under his breath. "That kid's ruining everything." Carlton forced a calm expression, though inwardly he was rattled. He had built his career on breaking down witnesses, but Emily was unlike any he had faced before. She hadn't relied on logic, details, or rehearsed responses. She had relied on trust in a dog whose presence disarmed fear itself. How could he counter something like that? Still, desperation often breeds creativity. A new strategy, When the judge entered and court came to order, Carlton rose with forced composure. Your Honor, the defense would like to call an expert witness to testify regarding the use of therapy animals in courtroom settings. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Judge Harrison peered over his glasses. Proceed. A man in a crisp suit stepped forward, introduced as Dr. Richard Halpern, a psychologist who claimed to specialize in child memory. He adjusted his glasses and smiled politely at the jury. Carlton began his questioning. Dr. Halpern, in your professional opinion, is it possible that the presence of a dog could influence a child's testimony? Certainly, Halpern replied smoothly. Children can form attachments to animals that provide comfort, but also reinforcement. If the child believes the dog expects a certain answer, or has been conditioned to associate the dog's signals with responses, their testimony could be unintentionally biased. Carlton nodded, casting a triumphant glance at the jury. So you're saying that Emily's testimony yesterday may not have been entirely reliable? Halpern folded his hands. It is possible, yes. While her sincerity may have been genuine, the accuracy of her memory could be compromised by her reliance on the dog as a crutch. The defendant smirked, clearly pleased. The prosecution strikes back, but Reynolds was ready. She stood, her voice calm but cutting. Dr. Halpern, are you aware that courtroom therapy dogs are legally recognized in over 30 states, precisely because they help child witnesses communicate truthfully without fear? Halpern shifted uncomfortably. Yes, I'm aware. And are you also aware, she pressed, that multiple peer-reviewed studies show therapy animals reduce stress and anxiety, which actually improves accuracy of testimony rather than hinders it? Halpern hesitated. There are studies, yes, though interpretations vary. Reynolds leaned in slightly, her tone firm. Doctor, can you point to a single case where a child's testimony with a therapy dog was proven false because of the dog's influence? Halpern's lips tightened. No, I cannot. A ripple of approval passed through the jury. Reynolds straightened. Thank you. No further questions. Carlton slumped in his chair, his attempt to discredit Emily backfiring spectacularly. An unexpected ally, just as the day seemed ready to adjourn, Reynolds surprised everyone. Your Honor, the prosecution calls Officer Daniels to the stand. The officer who had first introduced Max to Emily walked confidently to the witness stand. His uniform was pressed, his posture sharp, but his eyes softened as he glanced at Emily and Max, sitting quietly beside her mother. Officer Daniels, Reynolds began, can you explain to the court how Max came to be paired with Emily? Daniels nodded. Emily had been unable to speak since the incident. Traditional therapy wasn't working. We introduced Max as part of a pilot program for child witnesses. Within weeks, Emily began showing signs of progress. For the first time, she spoke words related to what happened. Not to a therapist, not to her mother, but to Max. The jury leaned forward. Daniels's voice carried the weight of quiet authority. Over time, he continued, Emily and Max developed a signal system. She would tap him, and he would respond with his paw. It became her way of grounding herself when fear tried to silence her. That's not bias, ladies and gentlemen. That's courage. That's a little girl finding her voice in the safest way she could. Emily's mother dabbed her eyes, while Emily herself leaned against Max, stroking his fur. The defense didn't dare cross-examine. The judge's warning, as the day drew to a close, Judge Harrison addressed the courtroom. His voice was firm, carrying the weight of his gavel. This trial is not about dogs or therapy methods. It is about truth and justice. The testimony we heard yesterday will be weighed with all other evidence. But let us not forget that this court exists to protect the vulnerable, not to silence them. His words echoed in the chamber. Even Carlton shifted uncomfortably, sensing the judge's patience wearing thin. The public's response outside the courthouse, the crowd had doubled. Supporters held signs with slogans like, "Justice for Emily" and "Pause for Truth." Children clutched stuffed animals shaped like German shepherds. News anchors reported live, their voices tinged with emotion. On social media, the hashtag because Max told me ICOULD had gone viral, with people sharing their own stories of overcoming fear and trauma. Veterans posted about service dogs who had helped them through nightmares. Parents posted about children with autism who found comfort in pets. Emily's story had become more than a trial. It was a movement. The defendant cracks in the holding cell that evening. The defendant paced like a caged animal. His temper flared, his fists slamming against the table. "This is all falling apart," he shouted. "A mutt and a kid. That's what's going to destroy me?" Carlton tried to calm him. "The jury hasn't decided yet. We still have closing arguments. Don't lose control now." But deep down, both men knew the tide had shifted. The confident facade was cracking, and desperation seeped through every word. Emily's quiet strength that night. Emily sat in her small bedroom. Max curled at her feet. The courtroom had felt like a battlefield, but here, under the soft glow of her nightlight, she finally breathed easily. Her mother tucked the blanket around her shoulders and whispered, "One more day, sweetheart. You've already done so much." Emily pressed her cheek to Max's fur, whispering back so softly her mother couldn't hear, "We're almost done, boy. Tomorrow we finish it." Max gave a low, contented woof, as if to say he understood. The stage is set. The trial was nearing its end. Closing arguments loomed, the jury's decision inching closer. The defense had played every card, but Emily's courage had reshaped the entire case. All that remained was the final push, the last chance for truth to triumph over fear. And in the center of it all was a little girl and her loyal dog, whose secret bond had grown into a force no one could have predicted. The final day of the trial dawned with a heavy stillness, as though the entire city held its breath. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was larger than ever. Reporters broadcast live updates. Children clutched handmade posters of German shepherds, and strangers from across the country traveled just to show support. Inside, the tension was palpable. The jurors looked weary but resolute, aware that they carried the weight of justice in their hands. Judge Harrison presided with calm authority, his gavel striking the bench as the session came to order. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said firmly, "we will now hear closing arguments." The defense's last stand defense attorney Carlton rose first. His suit was immaculate, his voice carefully measured, but his eyes betrayed the desperation he tried to conceal. "Members of the jury," he began, pacing slowly, "this trial is not about emotion. It is about facts. And the fact is, no one here actually saw my client commit the alleged crime. We rely on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a child." He paused, glancing at Emily with calculated coldness. "A child who needed a dog to tell her story. Can we really trust that? Children are impressionable. Dogs cannot speak. What you saw in this courtroom was not testimony, it was theater." Some jurors shifted uncomfortably. Carlton pressed on. "The prosecution would have you believe that a signal between a girl and her pet proves guilt. But the law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And doubt, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly what we have here." He stopped directly in front of the jury box, lowering his voice for effect. "Do not let sympathy cloud your judgment. Justice is not about tears. It is about truth." Carlton returned to his seat, shoulders stiff, knowing it was the best he could do. The prosecution's final words, Prosecutor Reynolds stood slowly, her presence commanding the room. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Members of the jury," she began, her voice steady, "the defense asks you to ignore what you saw with your own eyes. But let me remind you, Emily's courage yesterday was not theater. It was truth. She walked toward Emily, who sat quietly with Max at her side. This little girl found the strength to speak after months of silence. She did not point fingers lightly. She pointed because she remembered, because she trusted, and because justice demanded she tell you what happened. Reynolds turned back to the jury, her voice rising. We do not live in a world where children should be silenced because their bravery comes with help from a therapy dog, a counselor, or a parent's hand. We live in a world where truth should shine through, no matter how fragile the voice that carries it. She leaned on the jury box, eyes meeting each juror in turn. Emily was not alone yesterday. Max was with her. And because of that, she was able to tell you what happened. Do not mistake that for weakness. That is strength. Reynolds straightened, her tone solemn. Do not let this child's courage go unanswered. Show her, and every victim like her, that truth matters more than fear. Find the defendant guilty. The silence that followed was electric. The jury retires. Judge Harrison gave instructions to the jury, reminding them of their solemn duty. Then, with quiet determination, the jurors filed out of the courtroom to deliberate. The waiting began. Hours dragged on like days. Emily sat in the hallway with her mother, Max stretched across her lap. Reporters whispered, families paced, lawyers checked their watches. At one point, Max lifted his head, ears pricked, as though sensing the weight of the moment. Emily clutched his paw. Her mother knelt beside her. No matter what happens, sweetheart, you are so brave. You did everything you could. Emily nodded, but didn't speak. She simply rested her cheek against Max's fur, letting his steady heartbeat calm her racing thoughts. The verdict is reached late in the afternoon. The buzzer sounded. The jury had reached a decision. The courtroom filled again, the air thick with anticipation. The defendant sat rigid, his jaw clenched. Carlton whispered frantically, but the man didn't respond. Reynolds stood tall, hands folded neatly. Emily and her mother held each other's hands tightly, with Max lying at their feet, alert and silent. Judge Harrison looked at the jury foreperson. Madam Foreperson, have you reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. Please read it. The foreperson unfolded the paper. The room fell silent. In the matter of the people versus the defendant, she began, her voice echoing through the hushed chamber. On the charge of aggravated assault and endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. Gasps filled the room. Emily's mother covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. Reynolds closed her eyes for a brief moment, whispering a quiet thank you. The defendant slammed his fists on the table. This is a joke. He shouted, but bailiffs restrained him quickly. Carlton sank into his chair, defeated. Judge Harrison's gavel struck sharply. Order in the court. The verdict stands. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. Court is adjourned. The emotional release as soon as the gavel fell. Emily threw her arms around Max, burying her face in his fur. The dog licked her cheek as though he understood everything. The gallery erupted in applause, the sound reverberating through the chamber. Reynolds approached Emily's mother, her eyes soft. She did it, she said simply. Her mother, voice breaking, replied, No, they did it, together. She stroked Max's head. I'll never forget what this dog gave my daughter. Emily finally whispered, her voice steady for the first time in months. We won. Max, we really won. Aftermath and legacy outside the courthouse. The crowd cheered when Emily emerged holding her mother's hand, Max walking proudly at her side. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, but Emily didn't shrink back this time. She smiled faintly, whispering to Max, and the dog wagged his tail in response. The story made national headlines. Editorials praised Emily's bravery, and called for expanded use of therapy animals in courtrooms. Lawmakers debated bills to ensure more children could testify without fear. Across the country, families shared stories of how animals had helped them through trauma. The movement born from Emily's whisper became a national conversation. The hashtag because Max told me I could lived on, uniting people who had once felt voiceless. A quiet evening that night, in the peace of their small home, Emily lay in bed with Max, curled beside her. The glow of the lamp cast soft light across the room. Her mother sat nearby, smiling through tears of relief. Emily reached out, stroking Max's ear. "You were the bravest of all," she whispered. Max let out a low, happy woof and nuzzled closer. For the first time in a long while, Emily closed her eyes without fear. The nightmares had lost their power. The truth had set her free. And it all began with a secret gesture, a girl's trust in her dog that grew into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. The end.